Welcome to Whistle Where You Work, where today's topic, the greatest deliberative body in the world, or not, the United States Senate. I'm Mark Cohen, Executive Director of the Government Accountability Project. Case in point, how does a vast majority of legislators vote to pass a law only to find that one member in secret kills it? Does this sound like democracy to you? Well, not to Pete Sepp, Executive Vice President of the National Taxpayers Union, or to Tom Devine, Legal Director at the Government Accountability Project. Welcome to Whistle Where You Work.
Great to be here.
Tom, let's start with you. You worked and spearheaded a campaign that has gone on for many years, last year, to pass an amendment to fix the Whistleblower Protection Act, and had broad support. Large coalition supported it, and lots of support in Congress. Yet, at the last hour, it didn't pass. What happened?
Well, a major anti-secrecy reform was vulnerable to and was killed by a single senator's secret hold. When you said we had vast majority of support, that's an understatement. There were 534 members out of the 535 in Congress who approved this reform, which has been nicknamed the Taxpayer Protection Act. And that wasn't enough, the way our government is structured. And we were vulnerable to a secret Scrooge spoiling it for all of us, and he did.
All right, well, tell us how this came about. First of all, how do you know that 534 out of 535 members of Congress supported this?
Well, the last day of Congress, the House unanimously approved this reform. And it had to go over to the Senate for what seemed to be a formality due to one provision being removed from the legislation. The Senate had unanimously passed it 10 days earlier, but an hour before adjournment, one senator blocked having a vote to approve or reject it and left town without showing his or her face.
And this is permitted under the Senate rules?
This is actually quite a tradition under the Senate rules. A hold is like a passive filibuster. You have to have 60 votes to overcome it. And it can be done in secret. Unlike a filibuster, you don't have any accountability for what basically is a backroom procedure to block the will of the majority.
Now, since this year, Congress has revisited this. The Senate itself has revisited the hold rules, so that can't happen anymore, right?
The same scenario could repeat itself even under the new reforms. They don't block senators from making holds. They just say they can only stay secret for 2 days instead of 6, the previous rule. And for a bill which is in many significant laws, which are passed the last day or two of the session, this could happen over and over again.
Pete, this seems like it's a recipe for corruption, that you have a situation where a senator can put a hold on a bill at the end of a session, like happened here, do it on behalf of a special interest, on behalf of a major campaign contributor, maybe be stuffing their own pockets, who knows, and we, the public, can't find out. The taxpayers can't find out.
Yes, it can be an absolute travesty. In fact, we ran into the very same issue on transparency legislation that would create a database online of federal grants and contracts, and there was a secret hold placed on that legislation. It took us several weeks to smoke out the offending senator, and it turned out that several of them were in league with each other, placing the holds anonymously whenever the next one would get discovered as being the culprit. So this is a real problem in the United States Senate, and it's incredible in my 22 years with National Taxpayers Union how much resistance these whistleblower protections have met for absolutely no justification. There has been no argument put forth against these whistleblower rights or the reforms that we're trying to attain here that seems to stick to the wall. And yet we still have procedural roadblocks that are literally, I think, taking a human toll out in the government employment community.
Well, let's talk about that effort for the whistleblower reforms for smoking out, who put this hold on. There has been an effort that the Government Accountability Project, along with a program on National Public Radio, have collaborated to try to find who put this hold on, right, Tom?
That's correct. We've got it down to 5 senators at this point who haven't denied the hold. They haven't conceded it either. In fact, one of them, Senator Sessions, indicated that it really wasn't much of the public's business. He is a private person. I thought votes on laws were not private matters, but Senator McConnell, Senator Kyle, Senator Sessions, Senator Risch, and Senator Vitter have not deigned to tell the public whether or not they blocked this reform. And so they're the suspects.
And so did they do this kind of handoff routine, you think, that Pete was describing for the transparency bill?
Well, because the bill didn't come back for final approval to the Senate until an hour before adjournment, about an hour and a half before adjournment, they didn't have to. So we don't know whether there was a conspiracy or this was a lone wolf who was biting the taxpayers.
And any idea why somebody would do this in this case?
Oh, there's not much question. This is a reform which would make a real difference against government abuses of power that only can be sustained by secrecy. And it's probably fitting that this type of reform could only be defeated in secret.
Okay. Pete, your organization tends to be focused on issues of protecting taxpayers, has a lot of support on the Republican side of the aisle in particular, very influential organization on Capitol Hill. All of the senators that Tom mentioned are Republicans. What do you do to help to change their mind about how they respond to whistleblower protection law?
Well, first, we tell them about the history of National Taxpayers Union, the fact that we were co-founded by one of the greatest whistleblowers of all time, Ernie Fitzgerald, who set the standard for exposing wasted tax dollars in the federal government with the whole C-5 transport aircraft. We then went on to tell these senators, if you believe, for example, that the Internal Revenue Service Restructuring and Reform Act of 1998, which made tremendous strides for taxpayer rights and a more efficient tax administration system, if you felt that was a worthy legislative goal, you have whistleblowers to thank for that. Because prior to that time, when we worked on taxpayer rights legislation, we focused on bringing in customers of the IRS, people who had been abused bureaucratically, to testify before Congress. Well, the results were pieces of legislation that focused on procedural rights for taxpayers. And the problem soon became apparent that the bureaucracy itself didn't really care much about enforcing those rights, even if Congress enacted laws saying you had to do it. The institutional culture had to change. Only whistleblowers from within the IRS who could be brought forward to testify before Congress could possibly pinpoint those institutional problems and get us the legislation we needed.
So here we are, we're in 2012, you're trying to gin up a new effort. You have to start from scratch, right?
We have to start over procedurally. The homework's all been done, though. There's been 6 hearings on this legislation. We don't need to do any more research or prove any more points. And with 534 out of 535 members supporting the reform, we should be just kind of completing formalities to get expeditious approval, timely approval of this law. And it'll be a real test of the new majority's commitment, whether they're in as much of a hurry to give rights so that those who defend the public can defend themselves as they are to cut the budget directly. These are the folks who are going to be responsible to enforce any spending reforms or changes that Congress enacts. And if you don't have an executive branch that has the right to keep the bad apples honest, those reforms may not be worth the paper they're written on.
And how about that, Pete? The last election went off a lot on questions of government overspending and budgets and not taking care of the public treasury.
Yes.
And a lot of people got elected on that platform, Tea Partiers in particular. Yes. Where are they on this?
I think they're coming to the sensible position that if you have to establish an infrastructure for oversight, the very first place to start is with whistleblower protections. I'm pretty confident that as we meet with these folks one-on-one and explain to them the importance of the legislation, how it's a top priority with my organization, they're going to say, this makes sense. It's time to stop delaying on it. If we want to have good, credible information, a pipeline from the executive branch to Congress that we can depend on to identify and fix the flaws of government, this is the way to do it.
What kind of questions are you getting from these folks as you make your pitch to them? What kind of questions, doubts do they have, perhaps?
Well, I think one misconception revolves around the fact that this is somehow granting yet another privilege to government employees that others don't have. It's precisely the opposite. Federal employees are the ones who don't have whistleblower protections, even as those protections have been put into place for private sector employees and state and local government employees. So this is really a bill whose time has long come.
And so where are we with gaining passage of this bill? Is it going to happen in 2012, Tom?
Well, it better happen, but I haven't seen Congress in a hurry to act so far. And it's about the time that the voters reminded these politicians why they elected them. They can pass all the new laws they want, but laws aren't worth any more than the people who enforce them. And the public servants in the government, as opposed to the bureaucrats, the public servants need the freedom to do the right thing and to respect the mandate of the last election.
And it does seem that this is one of these issues where there's such widespread unanimity that everybody kind of recognizes, sure, we should empower the insiders to report waste and abuse and fraud. This is the way to ensure that we have a good government. Yet, as you observe, something happens every session of Congress, it seems, and often in secret in order to stifle this. Why do you think, Pete, it's going to be different this time, or do you?
Well, I think this time we've made a lot of progress toward answering any of the so-called obvious objections to this legislation. We've also made progress, I think, in identifying those who might have some kind of secret objection to it. This whole phantom issue, for example, of WikiLeaks. Again, they're getting it the exact opposite in arguing against whistleblower protections, because if you want to stop the kind of damage from WikiLeaks, you need to have those protections in place.
Well, tell me what they're saying about WikiLeaks when you talk to them.
Well, one issue that was raised in the last Congress that we heard when we were making the rounds was, oh, this is just another bill to empower people like Julian Assange types who will come forward and do damage to the federal government's national security.
Whistleblower? I mean,
yeah.
Why are they wrong about that?
And it's totally ridiculous, because WikiLeaks happens because government employees feel that they have no recourse, no protection. Who wants to destroy their entire career coming forward like that to bring this information to light?
And so they go secretly, they go anonymously to WikiLeaks and release this information rather than going through some protected source.
Yes.
Okay.
The whistleblower law is specifically structured to provide an alternative to anonymous leaks to the media or to outlets like WikiLeaks. It gives you free speech rights for working within institutional checks and balances. This couldn't be more cynical way to deceive the public than trying to kill alternatives to less responsible forms of dissent. This senator may have been a secret Scrooge for the taxpayers, but he was a secret Santa for WikiLeaks. They're the only action left. It's the safest thing to do because you engage in professional suicide if you try to work through proper channels.
Well, let's talk about how to work through proper channels. What should viewers do if they want to see action in the short term to reform the federal whistleblower law? Pete?
Anyone watching this program who considers themselves a fiscal conservative, I would appeal to them directly. This is a bill that is absolutely in our best interests for establishing a government that's accountable to taxpayers. They've got to get in touch with their members of Congress, especially the recently elected ones, and say very simply, support whistleblower protections. Do it now. We need these things in place if we are to have progress going forward.
Tom?
Well, it's very, very clear that whistleblower protections are the soul of the mandate from the last election. Almost every study that's been done shows that whistleblowers are responsible for detecting more institutional fraud than auditors, compliance officers, and law enforcement combined. The False Claims Act with fraud in government contracts, we are getting about $10 to $25 million per year until we enfranchise whistleblowers in the mid-'80s. A reform by a conservative Republican, Charles Grassley. Now we get over $1 billion in recoveries on the average each year, and it's been $2 to $3 billion annually over the last few years. There is no more effective resource that exists against fraud, waste, and abuse of government power. The whole keys to turning deficit reduction into reality than whistleblowers. And if these politicians are serious about fighting the debt, instead of just using this as an issue to help their political standing, then they're going to back the people who risk their careers for the campaign rhetoric.
Well, perhaps with the public eye fixed squarely on the anti-democratic rules of the Senate, 2012 will yet be the year of the federal whistleblower. Many thanks to Pete Sepp of NTU and Tom Devine of GAP for helping us better understand what chicanery passes for deliberative process in the Senate and for your tireless efforts to ensure that federal workers are protected when they speak out for the common good. We'll be back in a minute with highlights from our recent conference, Employee Rights and the Food Safety Modernization Act.